I've been camping all my life. My parents took us out when we were kids, me, my brother, and my sister, and later, as we got older, we started going on our own. We always liked finding a spot near water, usually a lake or a big pond, and setting up camp for a few days to just relax, cook over the fire, fish, and sit around doing nothing. It was one of those simple joys that made you feel like you were away from the world for a while. That summer, we had all agreed to go out together, the three of us. It had been years since we had camped as a group, now that we were adults, but we wanted to relive some of the old days. We picked a campground near a large lake, a place we had been to before, about an hour from where my grandpa lived. It was familiar and usually pretty quiet, and the forecast had called for warm weather, perfect for swimming and lounging outside. We arrived mid-afternoon and spent a couple of hours setting up the big tent, one of those old canvas ones that could sleep 4 or 5 people. It was bulky but sturdy, or so we thought. We pitched it right next to the lake, close enough that you could hear the gentle lap of the water on the shore when you lay inside. We stacked the coolers outside, set up the folding chairs, and gathered some firewood. It was going to be a lazy weekend. That first evening was calm. We grilled some burgers, ate chips and junk food, and stayed up watching the stars come out. I remember thinking how clear the night sky was, the moonlight bouncing off the surface of the water, the air still and soft. I barely noticed the clouds starting to gather on the horizon. We went to bed sometime after midnight, crawling into our sleeping bags, stretching out in the tent, listening to the sounds outside. Crickets, small waves lapping, the occasional rustle of leaves. I don't remember what time it was when I woke up, but something had changed. I opened my eyes and felt a deep pressure in my ears, that odd heaviness you get when the air is about to break open with a storm. The inside of the tent was stuffy, and I could hear the wind beginning to pick up outside. My siblings were still asleep. I lay there for a few minutes, listening, feeling the first prickles of unease crawling up my back. The wind kept growing. Soon, I heard the flap of the tent sides as the gusts hit harder. I unzipped my sleeping bag and sat up, feeling the walls of the tent shudder slightly. Thunder rumbled in the distance, long and low, but not cracking overhead yet. I peeked outside through the small mesh window and saw the trees swaying, the branches rocking violently. I could see flashes of lightning far off, lighting up the clouds. I remember wondering if I should wake the others, but before I could decide, the wind hit harder. The sides of the tent puffed inward and then outward like a balloon, the stakes in the ground straining. The thunder cracked again, closer this time, and the air lit up in a pulsing, white light. My brother stirred beside me, mumbling, and then we both sat up as a sudden roar came rushing over us. The wind screaming through the trees, the storm coming on faster than we could process. Within a few minutes, it became clear we couldn't stay in the tent. The rain began pounding down, sheets of water slamming against the canvas, and the wind was now strong enough that the poles were shaking. One corner of the tent lifted slightly, and we all scrambled, pulling on our shoes, trying to hold things down. It was chaos, the kind of wild, uncontrolled moment where instinct takes over. The tent started lifting again, one corner popping free, the whole thing threatening to tip. We yelled at each other to grab what we could, shoving sleeping bags and gear into armfuls, trying to keep everything from blowing away. But it was hopeless. The wind screamed like a freight train. The lightning was nonstop now, not even flashing anymore. Just a constant, flickering crawl of light through the black sky, the thunder rolling endlessly, shaking the ground under us. I had never seen a storm like it. We gave up on the tent. It was coming apart. We grabbed what we could carry and ran for the car, soaked to the bone, the rain cutting across our faces. The air was filled with debris, leaves, small branches snapping off and flying past us. The tent buckled and collapsed just as we slammed the car doors shut, and I watched through the windshield as the whole thing flipped and tumbled like a rag, finally slamming into a nearby tree. Inside the car, it didn't feel much safer. The vehicle rocked on its suspension, shuddering under the force of the wind. I gripped the edge of the seat, feeling the entire frame tremble. For a moment, we just sat there, breathing hard, watching the storm tear through the campground. I remember thinking we should stay put, wait it out, but then the car lurched again, this time harder, and a deep, instinctive alarm went off in my head. We needed to leave. Without saying anything, we started the car, headlights cutting through the sheets of rain, and pulled out of the campsite. Branches littered the road, water rushing across the dirt path like a shallow river. We drove slowly at first, trying to see through the downpour, the wind buffeting the sides of the car, every gust making the wheel shake in my hands. As we made it onto the main road, the storm kept hammering us. The lightning overhead was a continuous dance, jumping from cloud to cloud, crawling in long, jagged fingers across the sky. The thunder was one endless roar, a low, guttural growl that never let up. I had never been in a storm where the thunder just didn't stop. It wasn't a boom here and there. It was a constant, ground-shaking rumble that went on and on, vibrating through the car. We drove for about 20 minutes, white-knuckled, hearts pounding, until we reached my grandpa's house. He lived on the edge of a small town, tucked back from the main road, and we pulled in under the old carport, jumping out and running inside, drenched and shivering. That night, we barely slept. The storm raged outside, hammering the windows, rattling the walls, and we sat inside, wrapped in blankets, waiting for morning. It wasn't until the first light crept through the curtains that we felt safe enough to relax, the storm finally moving off, leaving behind a soaked, battered landscape. The next day, we drove back to the campground. As soon as we got close, we could see the damage. Trees were down, huge limbs snapped off and lying across the road. Part of the campground had been closed off, a small group of workers already out with chainsaws, clearing paths. We pulled up to our site and surveyed the wreckage. The tent was ruined, tangled up in the branches of a tree, one pole bent almost in half, the fabric torn and flapping. Our chairs were scattered across the ground. One of the coolers had been flipped and emptied, and debris was everywhere. We spent a few hours picking through the mess, salvaging what we could, stuffing the car with muddy, wet gear. As we packed up, one of the campground staff told us a small tornado had passed through the area during the night. We weren't sure if it had hit before or after we left, but from the looks of things, it had been close, too close. We left that afternoon, driving away quietly, still shaken by the experience. I kept thinking about how helpless we had been inside that tent, how easily things could have gone worse if we'd waited longer to leave. Later, when I unpacked at home, I realized I never found my sleeping bag. It was probably still tangled in the trees somewhere, blown away by the storm, lost to the night. To this day, I've never witnessed a storm so powerful, so frightening. The way the sky lit up, the way the wind roared and tore through the campground, the way we sat in that car, feeling it rock and shake under the force of nature, it left a mark on me. I've been camping since then, of course, but I'm always watching the sky a little more carefully now, always making sure I know where the car is, always ready to pack up at the first sign of trouble. Because sometimes, no matter how prepared you think you are, nature reminds you just how small you really are. And sometimes you're just lucky to walk away. My parents told me this story many times when I was growing up, and every time they told it, I could picture it so clearly in my head. It's not my story, but it feels like it is because I've heard it so often, and it always left a strong impression on me. It's one of those camping stories that sounds funny when you tell it later, but at the time, it was anything but funny. It was scary. My parents loved going on canoe trips. They were outdoors people, the kind who didn't just stick to the main trails or popular campsites. They liked to push far out, deep into the wilderness, far away from towns, people, even roads. They would load up their old aluminum canoe with everything they needed and paddle out into the remote parts of Saskatchewan, where the lakes and rivers seemed to go on forever, and you could camp for days without seeing another human being. This trip happened before I was born. They had taken off for one of their usual long canoe journeys, planning to be out for at least a week. They paddled deep into the backcountry, moving through lakes, streams, and narrow rivers, sometimes portaging between them, carrying the canoe overland when the water ran out. They were in their element. They always said those trips made them feel alive in a way nothing else did. The spot they set up camp on this particular trip was one they chose after several days of paddling. It was way out in nowhere, far from any settlement, on the shore of a small, quiet lake surrounded by dense forest. The only sounds were the wind in the trees, the call of loons across the water, and the occasional splash of a fish jumping. They pitched their tent on a small clearing just back from the water's edge, a little tucked into the trees, but with a clear view of the lake. They set up a fire pit, cooked some of their supplies, and settled in for the night. That night passed peacefully. The air was cool and still. The stars stretched out overhead in a perfect black sky, and the only noises were the natural sounds of the woods: crickets, rustling leaves, the soft lap of water on the shore. My parents were seasoned campers. They were used to the small sounds of the night, the occasional distant howl of a wolf or the croak of a frog, and none of it bothered them. They fell asleep feeling calm and relaxed, tired after a long day of paddling and carrying their gear. It was early the next morning, not even properly light out yet, when things took a turn. My dad was the first to stir. He was half asleep, the way you are when your body is still heavy and your mind is foggy, but something was tickling the edge of his awareness. There was a noise outside the tent, a kind of steady rustling. At first, he thought it was the wind, maybe the breeze picking up and shaking the branches, or perhaps a small animal rooting around. But as the seconds passed, the sound got louder. He lay there, still in his sleeping bag, eyes closed but listening. The rustling was close, very close. It wasn't the kind of far-off noise that blends into the background. This was right up against the tent, maybe just behind it, in the bushes. The weight of that realization slowly pushed through his sleepiness, and he sat up, heart starting to pick up speed. He was trying to piece together what it could be when, all at once, the entire side of the tent he was on collapsed inward, flattening on top of him. It wasn't a gradual thing. It was sudden and heavy, like something large had slammed down onto the tent wall, pushing it inward. My dad was crushed under the nylon and the weight behind it, barely able to react before it happened. The weight lifted almost immediately, leaving him gasping and flailing to sit up, tangled in the collapsed fabric. My mom scrambled awake beside him, both of them now fully alert, adrenaline rushing. They clawed at the tent zipper, unfastening it with shaking hands, and pushed their way out into the cool morning air. About 10 feet away, in the dim light of early dawn, stood a black bear. It was a big one. Not huge, not the biggest they had ever seen, but big enough to make your heart stop. The bear was facing them, its nose lifted slightly, ears pricked forward, looking both confused and concerned. It wasn't acting aggressive, not huffing or growling, just standing there, staring at the strange lump of nylon it had just toppled. From what my parents could piece together later, the bear had likely been foraging behind the tent, maybe digging around in the bushes or sniffing for berries. At some point, it must have lost its balance or leaned too far forward, and its weight had come down onto the tent, crushing it inward right on top of my dad. For a few long seconds, they all stood there. My parents on one side, barefoot and wide-eyed, the bear on the other equally surprised. And then, as quickly as it had come, the bear turned and trotted off into the woods, disappearing between the trees without a sound. My parents stood there, shaking, hearts pounding, watching the space where it had vanished. Slowly, the quiet returned. The sound of the breeze in the trees, the ripple of water against the shore, the calls of distant birds. The moment had passed, but the tension hung in the air for a long time. Once they were sure the bear was gone, they set about assessing the damage. The tent was crumpled on one side, the poles bent awkwardly where the weight had collapsed them. Their gear inside was a mess. Sleeping bags twisted up, the little stove and supplies jostled around. But nothing had been seriously destroyed. They spent the next hour carefully packing things up. They weren't about to stick around after that encounter. Even though the bear hadn't been aggressive, even though it had probably just been a startled accident, they knew better than to push their luck. Bears were unpredictable, and the last thing they wanted was for it to come back while they were sleeping or eating later. They loaded the canoe and pushed off from the shore, paddling back out onto the lake, the still water smooth under their paddles. They moved in near silence, both of them tense, glancing back toward the tree line, half expecting to see the bear watching them from the shore. But it didn't reappear. They paddled most of the day, retracing their route, covering as much distance as they could before making camp again, this time in a completely different spot. That night, they were more cautious, setting up further from the tree line, double-checking everything, making sure no food was left out, no scraps, no sense to attract another curious animal. The rest of the trip went by without incident. They completed the loop they had planned, moving from lake to lake, portaging through thick woods, paddling long stretches of quiet, open water. But the memory of that morning stuck with them. The weight collapsing the tent, the sudden, jarring moment when sleep had turned to panic, the sight of the black bear standing just a few feet away, blinking in the dim light, as surprised as they were. When they got home, they told the story to friends and family, and over time it became one of those tales that got told and retold, always getting a few laughs. My dad would joke that he was probably one of the few people who could honestly say they'd been sat on by a bear. But underneath the humor was a thread of something more serious. The reminder that when you're out in the wild, you're not in control. No matter how experienced you are, no matter how well prepared, nature doesn't care. They were lucky. Could have been worse. If the bear had been aggressive, if it had panicked instead of retreating, if it had decided to investigate the food stores, the situation could have turned dangerous very quickly. But instead, they had come away with a strange, unforgettable memory and a good story to tell. As for me, I grew up hearing that story and many others like it, always impressed by the calm way my parents handled themselves, always aware that when you go out into the wild, you need to respect the animals that live there. You need to remember that you're a visitor in their world. Even now, whenever I go camping or hiking, I think about that morning, about the way something can go from peaceful to terrifying in a heartbeat, about how sometimes the line between a funny story and a disaster is razor thin. And I always make sure to set my tent a little further from the tree line, just in case. Because you never know when you might end up with a bear sitting on your tent. I've been camping for years. I grew up going on family trips to parks and lakes, learning how to set up tents, how to build fires, how to pack food safely away from animals. By the time I was an adult, I was experienced enough to go on my own trips, and over time, I learned to love solo camping, too. There's something about the quiet, the peace, the feeling of being deep in the woods or on the edge of a lake with no one else around, that settles something deep inside me. But one particular trip stays sharp in my mind, and I don't think it'll ever fade. It was early autumn when I went out that year, the kind of time when the days were still mild but the nights were getting cooler, the leaves just starting to turn along the edges. I wanted to get one last trip in before the weather turned. So I packed up my gear, loaded it into the car, and drove out toward one of the big wilderness areas I'd always wanted to explore. The place I chose wasn't a marked campground, no marked sites, no bathroom buildings, no paved roads. Just forest, lakes, and a few old logging trails you could drive down if you had a sturdy vehicle. I parked where the road ended and hiked in with my pack, following a faint path that led along a chain of small lakes. The first day went smoothly. I hiked several miles in, found a good flat spot near the water, and set up my tent. I gathered some wood, made a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and watched the sun dip down behind the trees. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. As night came on, the sky filled with stars, cold and sharp in the clear air. I sat by the fire for a while, listening to the sounds of the woods, the occasional snap of a twig, the ripple of water on the lake, the distant call of a loon. When the fire died down, I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and drifted off. In the middle of the night, I woke up once, stirred by a sound outside. It wasn't much, just a light rustling, like something moving through the undergrowth. I stayed still, heart beating a little faster, listening. It could have been anything. A raccoon, a porcupine, maybe even a deer passing through. After a while, the noise faded, and I let myself relax, eventually falling back to sleep. The next day passed without anything unusual. I spent the morning hiking around the lake, followed a narrow trail deeper into the woods, took some photos, and collected kindling. In the afternoon, clouds moved in, and a light rain fell, but it cleared up by evening, leaving the forest fresh and damp smelling. I built another fire, cooked dinner, and settled in for another night. But that second night was when everything happened. It was probably around dawn when I woke up. The light outside was still dim, the faint gray of early morning before the sun really rises. I was half asleep, lying in my sleeping bag, when I heard the noise. At first, it was just a soft rustling, the same as the night before. But then it got louder, not just the occasional crackle of a branch, but the steady shuffling of something big moving close to the tent. I froze, heart suddenly hammering in my chest. My brain raced through the possibilities. A deer? Maybe a moose? But the steps were too slow, too heavy. And then, without warning, the side of the tent I was lying against collapsed inward. It wasn't like the tent sagging or the wind pushing it. It was the sharp, sudden weight of something pressing hard down on it. One moment I was staring up at the nylon roof. The next moment, I was half crushed under it, the cold fabric smothering my face. I let out a sharp gasp, my heart jumping into my throat, scrambling inside my bag as I tried to figure out what the hell had just happened. Then, just as quickly, the weight lifted. I shoved the tent material away from my face, unzipped the door with shaking hands, and stumbled out barefoot into the cold, dewy grass. My breath caught in my throat. About 15 feet away, standing near a patch of low bushes, was a large black bear. It was facing the tent, head slightly tilted, its eyes wide and ears pricked forward. It looked confused, almost concerned. His front paw was still halfway raised, like it wasn't sure whether to step forward or back. For a second, we just stared at each other, me heart pounding, standing there in nothing but a t-shirt and underwear, cold feet sinking into the wet ground, and the bear, big, heavy, dark, standing frozen in place like it wasn't sure what had just happened either. I could see the moment it decided. Its ears flicked, and it took a step back, then another. It turned slightly, looking one last time at the tent, and then, with a kind of slow, awkward shuffle, it slipped back into the trees. Not a rush, not a panic, just a kind of, oh no, sorry, my mistake retreat. I stood there for a long time, watching the bushes where it had vanished, my breath coming in shaky bursts. The woods were quiet again. No birds, no wind, just the drip of water from the trees. Slowly, I turned back to look at the tent. The whole side was crumpled, the poles bent, the stakes yanked halfway out of the ground. My gear inside was a mess, sleeping bag twisted, little camp items scattered. I moved carefully, eyes flicking back toward the tree-line every few seconds, ears straining for any sign of the bear coming back. But it didn't. It took me over an hour to clean up the site. I worked fast but cautiously, keeping my head on a swivel, nerves still raw. I knew that, realistically, the bear was probably long gone, but adrenaline doesn't care much about reason. I packed up the tent, double-checked that I wasn't leaving any food scraps or scented trash behind, and loaded up my pack. The hike back out was long. The trail seemed quieter than before, the woods more closed in, the shadows darker. Every sound made me jump, every snapping twig, every rustling leaf. My shoulders ached under the weight of the pack, but I kept a steady pace, forcing myself not to run, even though my body wanted nothing more than to get out of those woods as fast as possible. When I finally made it back to the car, I sat behind the wheel for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes closed, just letting the weight of the past few hours settle. I hadn't been hurt. My gear was a little damaged, sure, but nothing serious. And the bear hadn't been aggressive, just a big, curious animal that had accidentally stumbled onto my camp. But even now, I can still see the look on its face, that strange, almost human expression. Not anger, not fear, but simple, baffled concern, like it had just realized it had made a mistake and was awkwardly excusing itself. It's funny in hindsight, and I can laugh about it now, but at the time, in that early morning chill, standing barefoot on the wet grass with my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, it was one of the scariest moments of my life. That experience taught me something important, though. It reminded me that when we go into the wild, we're guests. We set up our little nylon homes and cook our little fires, and we think we've carved out a small space for ourselves. But the animals out there don't care about our plans. They're just moving through their world, doing what they've always done. I've gone camping since then, plenty of times. I've gone back into the woods, set up new campsites, hiked new trails. But I'm more careful now. I pay more attention to where I set up, how close I am to cover, how well I store my food, how alert I stay to the sounds around me. And sometimes, when I'm lying in my sleeping bag at night, listening to the small sounds of the forest, I catch myself smiling, remembering that big black bear, shuffling back into the woods like a clumsy neighbor who just knocked over the fence and wanted to quietly disappear before anyone noticed. In the end, I was lucky. The bear wasn't hungry or angry or aggressive. It was just there, and I happened to be there too. Two creatures crossing paths in the early morning light, both a little startled, both a little unsure, both ready to go our separate ways. I never found the tent poles I lost that day. Maybe the bear stepped on them and bent them beyond saving, or maybe they just got buried in the undergrowth as I packed up. But every time I pull out my camping gear now, I think about that missing piece, and it makes me grin a little, because how many people can honestly say they had their tent sat on by a bear? We had been planning the trip for months. It was the kind of plan you make when you've been stuck in work and routine too long, when the walls of your house start to feel a little too close, the traffic a little too loud, the day-to-day stuff a little too meaningless. Me and two friends, we wanted to get away from all that, even if just for a weekend. So we decided on a remote camping trip. Nothing fancy, just us, some tents, and the woods. We picked a state forest we'd read about online, deep enough into the backcountry that there were no official campgrounds, no picnic tables or bathroom stops, just trailheads and endless trees. It was late fall, cool but not yet cold, and we figured we could squeeze in one last trip before winter really started to bite. We packed light, sleeping bags, tents, some simple food, a little portable stove, water filters, a small hatchet, and a bundle of firewood we'd bought at a local shop. We knew we'd be far from any stores or help, so we were careful to bring what we needed, but not so much that we'd be weighed down. The drive out was long. We left the city early, before the sun was up, and by midday we were winding along narrow two-lane roads, past small farms and forgotten towns, watching the trees get denser and taller. Eventually, the pavement ended, and we bounced down a rutted dirt road until we reached the trailhead, an empty gravel lot with nothing but a faded wooden sign marking the start of the trail. We shouldered our packs and set off. The hike was longer than we expected. The trail twisted and dipped through the forest, winding around hills and crossing over rocky streams. We passed through stands of pine and oak, the ground thick with fallen leaves, the air cool and sharp. Birds flitted overhead, and every now and then we'd catch sight of a deer slipping through the trees. By late afternoon, we'd hiked deep into the forest, far from any road or house. We found a small clearing near a creek, the ground flat and soft, with a good space for a fire. We set up our tents, gathered some extra firewood, and got the fire going just as the sun slipped below the trees. We cooked a simple meal, canned stew heated over the flames, some bread, a little whiskey passed between us to warm up. We sat close to the fire, watching the shadows stretch out, listening to the crackle of the flames and the soft sounds of the woods around us. There's something about being that far from anything that makes you feel both small and free. We stayed up late, feeding the fire, talking, staring up at the stars. By the time we crawled into our tents, the fire was still burning, though we'd let it die down to a low, steady glow. The coals pulsed gently in the dark, throwing faint red light over the clearing. I fell asleep quickly, wrapped in the warmth of my sleeping bag, the sounds of the forest soft in my ears. It must have been hours later when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. I lay there, blinking into the dark, feeling the cold air on my face, the stillness of the tent pressing in around me. I could hear the soft rustling of leaves outside, the faint gurgle of the creek nearby, but nothing else. Then I noticed the fire. The light was wrong. I rolled onto my side, unzipped the tent flap just a little, and peered out. The fire was almost out, not just dying down naturally, but smothered, covered in dirt and ash, the faint glow buried under a layer of kicked-up soil. For a second, I was confused. We hadn't done that. We'd let the fire burn down, but we hadn't put it out. It should have still been glowing, maybe even flaring up a little if a breeze caught the coals. But now it looked like someone or something had come through and deliberately stamped it out. I felt a flicker of unease. I stayed still, listening hard, trying to pick up any sounds beyond the normal forest noise. That's when I heard the faint thud of hooves. My heart jumped. I slowly unzipped the tent a little more, peeking out into the clearing. There, just beyond the fire pit, were two large shapes. Wild boar. They were big. Even in the dim light, I could see their thick bodies, their bristly hides catching the faint starlight. They were snuffling around the camp, hooves scuffing the dirt, noses rooting at the ground. One of them had clearly kicked dirt over the fire, either by accident or maybe because it had been spooked by the smoke or heat. I froze. I knew enough to stay quiet. Wild boar aren't like deer or raccoons. They're aggressive, unpredictable, and strong. If they feel threatened, they'll charge. Their tusks can rip through flesh, and they have the mass to knock a person down without much effort. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, heart hammering in my chest. Minutes crawled by. The boar kept circling the camp, snorting and digging, occasionally kicking at the ground, their hooves scattering dirt and ash. Every time one of them got close to the tents, I felt a surge of fear, imagining what would happen if it decided to push its snout through the thin fabric to investigate the smell of food or people. But they didn't. They seemed more interested in the fire or what was left of it. It was almost like they were concerned about it, about the heat or the smoke or the flicker of light in the dark woods. They kept kicking dirt over it, stomping around it, pushing their snouts into the ash. Eventually, after what felt like hours, they drifted away. I listened carefully, straining to hear their heavy bodies moving through the underbrush, the faint snap of twigs underfoot, the soft huff of their breath. When I was sure they were gone, I let myself relax, just a little. But I didn't sleep again that night. The cold settled in harder without the fire, creeping into my sleeping bag, numbing my fingers and toes. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the sounds of the forest, waiting for dawn. When the first pale light touched the trees, I crawled out of the tent, stiff and shivering. My friends were awake too, their faces pale and tired. We didn't need to say anything. We all knew what had happened. We moved around the camp carefully, checking for any signs of damage. The fire pit was a mess, the coals buried under a thick layer of dirt and hoof prints. Our gear was untouched, but the ground was torn up, the soil kicked and churned by heavy hooves. We packed quickly. None of us wanted to stick around longer than we had to. The hike back was long, our packs heavier somehow, our steps slower. We kept glancing over our shoulders, listening for any sounds in the woods, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves setting our nerves on edge. By the time we reached the trailhead, we were exhausted, both physically and mentally. We loaded our packs into the car, climbed in, and sat there for a long moment, just breathing, feeling the warmth of the heater slowly seep into our frozen fingers. Driving away, I kept thinking about the way the boar had acted. They hadn't come looking for food, not really. They hadn't attacked our tents or scattered our gear. They'd been focused on the fire, on stamping it out, on kicking dirt over it until it was gone. Almost like they were worried about it, like they saw it as something dangerous or unnatural in their space. It was a strange thought that these wild animals, these big, heavy, rough creatures, had a kind of caution, a kind of awareness about the fire that went beyond simple curiosity. But maybe that's just how it is out there. The forest has its own rules, its own rhythms. We were just visitors passing through, bringing things, fire, noise, light that didn't belong. That trip stuck with me, not because of any big, dramatic moment, but because of the quiet, creeping tension of it. The slow realization that we were small and vulnerable, that the forest wasn't just a backdrop for our adventure, but a living, breathing world full of creatures that didn't care about us, that might even see us as a threat. We were lucky that night. The boar could have charged, could have wrecked our camp, could have hurt us badly. But they didn't. They did what they needed to do. They put out the fire, they made sure their space was safe, and they left. It was a reminder, one I won't forget. Out there, far from roads and houses and help, you're not in control. You're just another animal in the woods, hoping the others decide to leave you alone. And next time, I'll make sure the fire's out before I sleep. We always liked to head out into the woods in the fall. There's something about Georgia in the fall that's hard to explain if you haven't been there. The air gets cool, but not usually cold, and the leaves change just enough to paint the woods with these dull golds and rusty reds. It's a quiet season, one where the bugs start dying down, the crowds are gone, and the trails feel empty and still. Me and my group of friends, usually 3 or 4 of us, would pick a trailhead, load up our packs, and hike several miles down into the woods, just far enough that we'd be away from any other campers. We didn't like setting up near parking lots or near places where people might wander through at night. We liked it quiet, away from anyone else, just us and the trees and the stars. On this trip, we'd picked a spot about 5 miles down a trail in northern Georgia. It was mid-fall, cool during the day, and we weren't expecting anything more than the usual light chill at night. We packed light but brought the basics: tents, sleeping bags, food, water, some snacks, a small hatchet for firewood, and a lighter for the fire. The hike in was good. The trail wasn't too hard, just a steady walk through the woods, with a few hills but nothing rough. We reached a spot near a slow-moving creek and decided it was the right place to set up camp. The ground was flat, the trees were spaced out enough for us to move around comfortably, and we had access to water if we needed it. We set up 2 tents, gathered wood, and got a fire going before sunset. By the time night came, we were in good spirits. We cooked a simple meal over the fire, ate until we were full, and sat back on logs we dragged over, feeling the warmth of the flames on our faces. The stars were just coming out, little pinpricks of cold light, and the woods around us were dark and still. Then, almost without warning, the temperature dropped. It was strange how fast it happened. One moment it was cool, maybe in the low 50s, the kind of temperature you expect for fall nights out there. Then, within an hour, it was down in the low 20s. That's rare for Georgia, even in late fall. We could see our breath puffing out in front of us in little clouds, and the ground around the fire started to harden with frost. We weren't exactly dressed for that kind of cold, but the fire helped. We piled on extra wood, got the flames roaring high, and sat close, feeling the heat soak into our skin. By the time we were ready to sleep, we were stuffed with food and half sleepy from the warmth. We climbed into our tents, zipped up our bags, and settled in. I remember thinking how cold it was going to be overnight, but the sleeping bag was good quality, and I figured the fire would keep the edge off. I drifted off, listening to the crackle of the flames and the occasional soft creak of the trees in the cold air. At some point in the night, I felt something tapping against my foot. It was light, like the end of a stick, just a few soft nudges through the tent wall. I pulled myself slowly out of sleep, confused and a little annoyed. My mind was foggy, and for a second, I just lay there, blinking up at the ceiling of the tent, trying to figure out what was going on. The tapping came again. I shifted in my bag, turned toward the entrance of the tent, and saw the faint outline of my buddy crouched outside, poking gently at the tent with a long stick. He didn't say anything, just kept tapping until he saw me sit up. Then he pointed with the stick toward the fire. At first, I couldn't understand what he was pointing at. I squinted, eyes still adjusting to the low light, the dim red glow of the fire, and then I saw them, 2 wild boar, standing near the edge of the fire pit. They were big, at least 150 pounds each, probably more. Heavy bodies, thick legs, coarse, bristly hair catching the low light, long snouts rooting in the dirt. They were kicking at the ground, snuffling and grunting, tearing at the soft earth near the edge of the fire. My mouth went dry. I knew enough about wild boar to know they weren't something you wanted to mess with. They were aggressive, territorial, and strong. They could gore you with their tusks if they felt threatened, and they had a reputation for being unpredictable. We didn't have any weapons, just a small hand axe we'd left next to the firewood pile, out of reach. I stayed perfectly still, heart pounding hard in my chest, watching the 2 shapes move around the edge of the camp. The fire was dying down now, the wood mostly burned away, leaving a bed of glowing coals. Without the bright flames, the cold felt sharper, creeping into the tent, seeping through the thin layers of fabric and insulation. But I barely noticed. Every part of me was focused on those 2 animals, watching them dig and snort, their hooves scuffing up the dirt, their heavy bodies shifting back and forth as they explored the camp. Time stretched out. We lay there, my friend and I both still, both wide awake, both watching. The boars moved slowly, circling around the fire, kicking at bits of leftover food scraps, nosing at the edge of the tents. At one point, one of them came close enough that I could hear its breath, a heavy, snorting sound just on the other side of the thin tent wall. I clenched my hands into fists, forcing myself not to move, not to make a sound. An hour passed like that, maybe longer. I lost track of time, caught in this strange, stretched out moment of waiting, muscles tense, skin cold, heart hammering like a drum. Finally, after what felt like forever, the boars seemed to lose interest. They drifted back toward the trees, their shapes blending into the darkness, their heavy bodies moving in and out of the faint light. I watched them go, waiting, barely breathing, until I was sure they were gone. And then I let myself relax, just a little. I lay back in my bag, eyes open, staring up at the dark ceiling of the tent, feeling the cold seep into my bones. I didn't fall asleep again that night, neither did my friend. We just lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest, waiting for the sun to rise. When dawn finally came, the world outside was pale and frosty, the ground hard and glittering with ice crystals. We crawled out of our tents, stiff and cold, moving carefully, checking the edges of the camp. There were deep hoof prints near the fire, patches of torn-up earth where the boars had dug. Our small woodpile was scattered, but otherwise, everything was intact. We packed up quickly. Neither of us said anything, but we both knew we didn't want to stick around any longer than we had to. The hike out was quiet, our breath misting in the cold morning air, our boots crunching over the frosty trail. When we reached the car, we loaded our packs, climbed inside, and sat for a long moment, just breathing, feeling the heat from the vents slowly warm our frozen hands. I thought about how close we'd come to something going wrong. Wild boars aren't like deer or raccoons. They don't run away when they're spooked, they charge. If we'd startled them, if one of us had made a sudden noise or shifted in the tent, if they decided to investigate the smell of food or the warmth of the fire more aggressively, it could have ended very badly. We had no real protection, no way to fight them off. We were completely vulnerable out there, lying on the cold ground, separated from 150 pounds of angry muscle and tusks by nothing more than a few layers of nylon. It was a humbling reminder. When you're out in the wild, you're not at the top of the food chain. You're just another animal, lying in the dirt, hoping the bigger, stronger creatures decide to leave you alone. We drove home in silence, the forest slipping away behind us, the trees thinning out, the road winding back toward familiar towns and safe places. I kept thinking about the moment when I saw the boars for the first time, the way they moved, the heavy sound of their hooves on the frozen ground, the sharp stink of them on the cold air. It wasn't just fear I'd felt in that moment. It was something deeper, a kind of raw animal awareness, the sudden, sharp understanding that I was small and fragile and exposed. We were lucky that night. We didn't do anything heroic. We didn't fight the boars off or scare them away. We just lay there, quiet and still, and waited for the danger to pass. And it did, this time. But ever since that trip, I've been more careful. I pack differently. I plan differently. I think about the things that can go wrong, the animals that might wander through the camp, the cold that can drop faster than you expect. I respect the woods a little more, not because they're magical or mystical, but because they're real and they're full of things that don't care about you one way or another. I'll keep camping. I'll keep hiking, but I'll never forget that night, lying frozen in my sleeping bag, heart pounding, while two wild boar tore up the dirt just a few feet away. And I'll never forget how lucky we were to walk out of those woods in one piece. I still think about that trip sometimes, usually when I'm sitting in a quiet room, when it's late at night and the house is still. It was a trip that felt simple at the time, a kind of bucket list thing I wanted to check off. I had always dreamed of seeing Africa, not just from a tour bus or some safe hotel window, but properly, out in the bush where the real land was, where the animals moved free. I didn't want a tourist safari all staged and packaged. I wanted the real wild, So I signed up for a guided camping trek, one that took a small group deep into a national park in southern Africa. We were told up front, this was no luxury trip. We'd be hiking by day, camping under the stars by night, carrying what we needed on our backs. There would be no fences, no permanent camps, just open land, guides who knew the terrain, and the understanding that we were guests, not rulers in that space. I was excited, nervous, sure, but mostly excited. The group was small, just me, 2 other travelers, and 2 local guides. We set out early one morning, under a pale sun and a wide, cloudless sky. The land stretched flat and endless around us, golden grasslands broken by clumps of trees, rocky outcrops, and the occasional dry riverbed. We walked for hours, stopping only to drink water and rest in the shade when the heat grew heavy. I remember the sharp smell of the grass, the gritty taste of dust on my tongue, the way the horizon shimmered in the heat. We saw animals in the distance, herds of antelope moving in graceful lines, a lone giraffe towering above the treetops, birds flashing bright against the sky. By late afternoon, we reached the place where we'd camp for the night, a flat area near a shallow waterhole. It wasn't a busy watering spot, the guides assured us, but we still set up camp a little distance away, just to be safe. We pitched simple tents, gathered dry wood, and got a small fire going as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the grass. We cooked a simple meal, beans, rice, some dried meat, and sat close to the fire, listening to the sounds of the land settling in for the night. Somewhere out there, a hyena called, its eerie whoop carrying on the wind. I felt small sitting there, wrapped in my jacket, watching the stars blink to life one by one. It was late when I crawled into my tent. The fire was still burning, a low, steady glow, the coals pulsing softly. The guides had told us to keep it going through the night. Not because it would scare off all the animals, they were clear that many creatures didn't care about a small fire, but because it gave us light and a sense of safety, and sometimes that was enough. I drifted off to sleep, the faint crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside lulling me down. Somewhere deep in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. I lay there, heart beating slow and heavy, listening hard. I could hear the normal sounds, the soft rustle of grass, the creak of the tent fabric as the wind stirred it, the faint snap of something shifting in the fire pit. But then I heard something heavier, a slow, deliberate thud. Not the light step of an antelope or the skitter of a small animal. Something big. I stayed perfectly still, my eyes wide open in the dark, every sense straining. The noise came again, a heavy footfall, the faint crush of grass under weight, the slow, careful breath of something large moving close. I reached out, feeling blindly for the zipper of the tent. Slowly, carefully, I eased it down just a little, just enough to peek out. What I saw stopped my breath in my throat. There, standing near the fire, was a rhinoceros. It was enormous, its bulk catching the faint light from the coals, its rough, armored hide gleaming faintly. Stood still, head lowered slightly, ears flicking. I watched, frozen, as it shifted closer to the fire, moving with a slow, deliberate weight that made the ground seem to tremble. I'd never been that close to one before. I'd seen pictures, sure, and maybe caught glimpses from a distance earlier in the trip, but nothing prepares you for the sheer mass of the thing when it's right there, close enough to touch. I lay there, heart pounding so loud I was sure it could hear it, barely daring to breathe. The rhino stood over the fire for a moment, snuffling, its massive head swinging slowly from side to side. Then, almost casually, it pawed at the ground. Dirt sprayed over the fire. It did it again, and again, until the coals were buried, the last flicker of light smothered under a layer of earth. Then it stood there a moment longer, as if checking its work. Finally, it gave a soft huff, turned, and lumbered away into the dark. I lay there, muscles locked, waiting, listening. I heard the slow fade of its heavy steps, the faint crash of branches, the soft stir of grass, and then silence. I didn't sleep again that night. Without the fire, the cold crept in fast, seeping through my clothes, biting at my fingers and toes. I lay in the dark, eyes wide, watching the faint shapes of the tent walls, listening to the empty hush outside. Every sound seemed sharper, every rustle a possible threat. By dawn, I was stiff and shivering, every muscle aching from tension. The guides were up early, moving carefully around camp, checking for tracks, making sure nothing else had come through. I climbed out of the tent slowly, legs shaky, eyes gritty with exhaustion. The fire pit was a mess. Dirt kicked up and scattered, coals smothered under a thick layer of soil. The guides studied the prints and nodded. Rhino, they confirmed. A big one. We packed up quickly. None of us wanted to linger. There was no panic, no rush, but there was a quiet understanding that we were in the middle of something much bigger and stronger than us, and the best thing we could do was move on, respectfully, calmly, without drawing more attention. The hike out was long and heavy. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that massive shape again, moving silently through the grass. But the land was empty, just endless stretches of golden fields and scattered trees, the sun rising slow and hot above us. By the time we reached the edge of the park, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. Back in the small lodge where we regrouped, I sat for a long time just drinking water, staring out at the land. I kept thinking about the rhino, about the way it had approached the fire, the way it had deliberately put it out, not out of fear, but out of something like caution or instinct, as if it had a job to do. It wasn't angry, it wasn't aggressive. It was just steady, deliberate, purposeful. That stuck with me. I'd gone into the trip thinking of myself as the adventurer, the one stepping boldly into the wild. But the truth is, I was just a visitor, small and unimportant in a place that had its own rules, its own rhythms, its own ancient understandings. I still tell people about that trip, but I don't play up the drama or make it into some daring story. I tell it quietly, carefully, because what I remember most isn't the fear, though there was plenty of that, but the realization of just how small I was in the face of something so big, so old, so certain. Out there, under the wide sky, surrounded by endless grass and stone, you're reminded very quickly that you are not in charge. You are a guest, and sometimes the local firefighters show up to remind you. I never thought a joke from an old movie would come back to me like this. Started as just a story. I'd watched The Gods Must Be Crazy back when I was a teenager, laughing at the goofy scenes, especially the one where a rhinoceros snuffed out a campfire. I remember turning to my brother back then and saying, "That's gotta be made up. There's no way rhinos care about fires." He agreed. We never thought twice about it. Until years later, when I went on that camping trip in southern Africa. I was in my early 30s then, tired of city life, itching for something different. I'd saved up vacation time, enough to travel somewhere big. Not just another weekend beach trip or a lazy hotel stay, but something real, something out in the wild. Africa had always been on my list. I booked myself on a guided trekking tour, the kind where you hike through big, open lands, sleep under the stars, and carry everything you need on your back. It was no luxury trip, but I didn't want that anyway. I wanted to feel the earth under my boots, to hear the sounds of the wild at night, to know what it was like to be small and human in a place where animals still ruled. The group was small, just me, another solo traveler named Peter, and 2 local guides. They knew the area like the back of their hands, experienced men who had grown up nearby and understood the land in ways I never would. We hiked for days through dry savanna, golden grass stretching as far as the eye could see, dotted with thorny trees and the occasional rocky outcrop. We saw antelope darting through the brush, giraffes stretching for the tops of trees, warthogs trotting nervously across dusty paths. Every evening, we set up camp far from the roads, far from people, cooking simple meals over a small fire and sharing stories under the stars. I felt alive. But as the days passed, I noticed something. The guides were careful about fire. They kept it small, always ringed with stones, always watched. One night, when Peter and I were laughing about the old rhino fire joke from The Gods Must Be Crazy, one of the guides gave us a long, steady look, then shook his head slightly and walked away. He didn't say a word, but something in his face told me it wasn't just a funny story to him. I remember thinking, maybe there's more truth to that scene than I realized. It was on our 6th night when things turned strange. We'd set up camp near a dry riverbed, a place that seemed safe, quiet. There were animal tracks here and there, but nothing fresh, nothing big. We cooked dinner, simple rice and beans, and sat by the fire, the sky overhead thick with stars. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, I was sore and tired, the good kind of tired that comes from hours of walking, from breathing clean air all day. I fell asleep fast, the quiet sounds of the night settling around me. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up. First, I thought it was the cold. The nights out here dropped sharply in temperature, and even inside the tent, I could feel the chill creeping in. I pulled my jacket tighter and rolled over, trying to drift back to sleep. But then I heard it, a low, steady thud. I froze, heart jumping. I strained to listen, my ears picking up the faint crackle of the dying fire, the soft rustle of grass, and that slow, deliberate sound. Thud, pause, thud. It wasn't a light step. It wasn't the flutter of a bird or the skitter of a small animal. This was heavy, solid. Each step sent a faint vibration through the ground, the kind you only feel when something massive is moving close. My hands trembled as I reached for the tent zipper. I moved slowly, carefully, easing it down just enough to peek out. In the faint glow of the fire, I saw it. A rhinoceros. It was enormous, larger than I had imagined. Its body thick and armored, its horn catching the faint light. It stood near the fire, head lowered slightly, ears flicking as it studied the glowing coals. I held my breath, heart pounding so loud I was sure it could hear it. The rhino shifted forward, slow and careful, its massive feet crunching softly on the dry ground. It reached the fire pit, gave a low snort, and pawed at the dirt. A spray of soil covered part of the fire. It did it again and again, kicking dirt over the flames, smothering the light. I watched, frozen, as the last flickers of the fire disappeared under the earth. The night closed in around us, thick and dark. The rhino stood there a moment longer, as if checking its work. Then it gave a soft, rumbling grunt, turned, and slowly lumbered away, its massive form fading into the shadows. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, barely daring to breathe. When I finally let myself move, I lay back down, shaking, every muscle tight and cold. Without the fire, the chill crept in fast, wrapping around me like a wet blanket. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter, trying to keep warm, but the cold seeped into my bones. The night stretched on, endless and heavy. Every sound, the creak of the tent fabric, the whisper of wind through the grass, the faint rustle of movement out in the dark, made my heart jump. I didn't sleep. When the faint light of dawn began to creep over the land, I unzipped the tent slowly, carefully. The air was cold and still. I stepped out, legs stiff, eyes gritty with exhaustion. The fire pit was a mess, dirt scattered everywhere, the coals buried deep under a layer of earth. The guides were already up, checking the ground, reading the tracks. They confirmed what I already knew. A rhino had come through. Peter and I exchanged a look, a long, tired, shaken look. We didn't speak, but I knew we were both thinking the same thing. That scene from The Gods Must Be Crazy wasn't just a joke. It wasn't some silly, made-up moment for laughs. It was rooted in something real, something ancient, something I hadn't understood before. We were visitors here. We were small, soft, breakable. And out here, the animals didn't play by our rules. We packed up camp quickly that morning. There was no panic, no rush, just a quiet, focused urgency. We moved carefully, respectfully, making sure we left no trace, no mess, no reason for any creature to take interest in us again. The hike out was long and hard. My legs ached, my back hurt, and the pack felt heavier than it had all trip. But I kept walking, one foot in front of the other, eyes scanning the land, heart still beating a little too fast. When we finally reached the edge of the park, stepping onto the rough dirt road that marked the boundary, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Back at the small lodge, I sat on the porch, staring out at the land, watching the wind ripple through the grass. I kept thinking about that night, about the heavy steps, the snuffling breath, the deliberate way the rhino had put out the fire. It hadn't been angry, it hadn't been scared. It had just been doing what it knew to do. And me? I was just a visitor, just another human passing through, small and unimportant in a place shaped by creatures much older, much stronger, much more certain of their place in the world. That trip changed how I saw things. When people ask me now about my time in Africa, I don't tell them about the photo ops or the beautiful sunsets. I tell them about the night the rhino came to our camp, about the way it kicked dirt over the fire, about the way I lay there, frozen and shaking, realizing for the first time just how small I really was. I tell them that sometimes the old stories, the jokes from movies, the strange little details you laugh off, sometimes they come from something real, something true. And sometimes, when you're out there under the stars, far from home, far from safety, those old truths come walking right into your camp, heavy and solid and undeniable, to remind you exactly where you stand.